Part 2. Dog Meat. 10. Luke's eyes snapped open. He didn't move. The back of his head was a hot mess of agony. He was on his back, the sun high in the sky above, his axe resting uncomfortably under his right shoulder. His field of vision was framed by the buildings either side of the alley he had walked into the night before. Ambushed. The bastards had ambushed him with the oldest trick in the book, and he had fallen for it, hook, line, and sinker. Time to take stock. He moved his feet, then his hand. He didn't appear to have any injuries besides a cracked skull. He scanned the alley with his eyes, not trusting yet that he could move his head without its contents spilling out onto the ground. He was alone. Time to move, old boy. He braced himself with his elbows and pushed up. Luke wasn't sure what horrified him more, the white agony that shot through his head, or the sound of his hair, glued to the cracked pavement by crusted blood, pulling free. He sat until the roar of pain rushing through his head subsided to a dull throb, then slowly raised himself to his feet. The world tilted, and for a second he thought he would fall back on his ass. He didn't. He raised his hand to the back of his head and inspected the damage. Thankfully, it wasn't as bad as it felt. His gently probing fingers found a hell of a bump crowned with a split in the skin under his stiff hair. The wound was about 1.5 inches long, but it had crusted over, the coagulants in his blood doing their job. Turning gingerly, he took stock of the crime scene. His backpack was gone. Clearly it was the intended target of the wild-eyed bastards. There was no sign of the ambushers. Sore but thankful that he was still breathing, he couldn't even raise a puff of anger. There was no point trying to find the backpack. There were 1,000 places the little bastards could be hiding, and he didn't want to risk foraging for replacement supplies and risk another ambush. The only thing to do was to get back on the road again. As he left the alleyway, he found the map from his backpack wedged under the old paling fence, one corner flapping in the breeze as if to catch his attention. He dusted it off, refolded it, and slipped it inside his jacket. Erring on the side of caution, he pulled out his axe and held it as a deterrent as he made his way back out of Bow Lake Village. This time he traveled via the 202A, a wider road and a lot more pleasant to walk along than the other one that had taken him into the village. It would take him southeast to join up with its big sister, the 202. The day was warm. Besides flies annoying the hell out of him, he didn't have any more trouble as he continued his journey and stowed his axe after half a mile. After an hour of walking, he reached the 202, and ignoring the angry noises coming from his stomach, pulled out the map. In just over a mile, he would pass the North River Pond, a big freshwater lake. That would be his first stop. At the very least, he would drink a bellyful of water and wash the crusted blood from his still sore head. The North River Pond was also picturesque. The part of the shoreline he accessed was overgrown with long, lush grass. He took off his jacket and headed into the water, gingerly washing his hair and the wound before moving to a new spot and drinking his fill of the cool, fresh water. As he was getting out, he found an old plastic soda bottle floating by the shoreline. He washed it out as best he could before refilling it with water from the lake. That would hopefully keep him hydrated for a day. He put his jacket back on and, feeling refreshed, investigated 2 houses on the lake for food. Their pantries were bare. The colonel's teams had obviously been this way. He resigned himself to the fact he probably wouldn't find food anywhere on the 202 and would have to make his way off it to get lucky. Dusk came 2 hours after his stop at the lake, and he decided when passing through a small town he would camp there for the night. Town was too generous a word, really. It was more a cluster of homes that seemed to have sprung up like mushrooms alongside a gas station general store. Luke didn't bother checking the store. Its windows were smashed in and its door lay in pieces on the pavement. Through the windows it was easy to see the shelves were barren. He didn't hold out much hope for the houses that ran along the side street either, but decided he would check up to 3 of them for food. If he had no luck, he would bed down for the night in the 3rd one. The first 2 were empty, and he almost didn't bother with the next. Boy, was he glad he made the effort. The front door was already open, jimmied by past raiders, and he didn't waste any time heading straight to the kitchen. There, in the failing light, sitting on the small formica-topped kitchen table like it had been left by a thoughtful friend, was a pistol and 2 clips of ammo. Luke froze. "What the?" he whispered, and cocked his head to listen to the empty house, unable to believe that someone had left such a valuable prize behind accidentally. He didn't hear a sound in the abandoned house, and quietly crossed to the table and picked up the gun. It was a Glock 17. He weighed it in his hand and knew from its heft that it already had a full clip. Managing a firearm one-handed was a bitch, but he got to it without complaining. He placed the gun on the table, and with his left forearm, wedged it against the table and pulled the slide with his good hand. There was a round in the chamber. Good. First job was to make sure that the owner of the gun wasn't in the house. It only took a few minutes. With newly discovered gun in hand, he searched the house quickly and silently. It was empty save for the mummified remains of the previous owners in the main bedroom. The husks of the dead didn't bother him anymore. It didn't take long to figure out live bodies were the much bigger danger in post-America. The other bedroom was empty, and there was no obvious sign anyone had been there recently. "Finders keepers," he said cheerfully as he re-entered the kitchen, not lowering the weapon until he was sure that room was empty also. He put the Glock back on the table and went to the pantry, fully expecting to see empty shelves. And they were, apart from 1 lone can of salt-reduced whole tomatoes. He was not a fan of tomatoes, nor were the previous raiders apparently. Tonight, though, as hungry as he was, it was like the clouds had parted, shining a beam of light on a heavenly delicacy. Plus, it had a ring pool. Bonus! Luke swallowed the tomatoes right out of the can, drinking them down like a thirsty man guzzling water, only stopping to chew the larger chunks when they threatened to choke him. He washed it down with a swallow of the bottled pond water. As dusk turned to night, and with a semi-full belly, Luke headed through the house to the corpse-free bedroom and climbed wearily onto the single bed, boots and all, careful not to bump his tender head on the ornate wooden bedhead. He slept soundly. 11. Luke left the next morning at dawn. He didn't eat for most of that day, and by mid-afternoon, hungry again, he managed to shoot a skinny-ass rabbit he spotted in some long grass by the road. He took it into the front yard of a house, skinned it, and cooked it over an open fire. He'd started the fire with the lens of a magnifying glass. He had carried that damn thing in his pocket since they had left the farm and was gratified to finally get to use it. Initially, he'd been worried about the smoke and attracting unwanted attention. His hunger overrode that caution, and in the end, it wasn't the attention of the 2-legged variety he needed to worry about. He spotted them as he ate. They were slinking around about 1/4 of a mile behind him, not game to come any closer, even with the delicious smell of cooked rabbit in the air. He paid them no mind, other than to glance at them occasionally as he ate. They loitered where they were, apparently too chicken to come any closer. After he'd eaten his fill, Luke pulled off the last strips of meat and stored them in an old plastic grocery bag he'd picked up off the road that morning. Thank God for non-degradable plastics, huh, Bugs? He left the ravaged rabbit carcass on the grass for the dogs, then moved on. He glanced over his shoulder at them occasionally. The dogs moved cautiously until it was clear the carcass was closer to them than he. Then they pounced on the kill. He watched them brawl over it for a while, then rounded the bend, out of sight. Hopefully that would keep them busy for a while. At dusk he found another empty house to spend the night in. There was no exciting find in this one, but there was a bed. He had a few pieces of rabbit and went to sleep thinking of Brooke. The thought of her brought pain, but also warmth. He ate the rest of the rabbit the next morning, knowing it wouldn't be good for much longer, and then hit the road again. He didn't see the pack anywhere. A few hours later, he skirted Rochester on the 202 and crossed the border into Maine. That's when he discovered the dogs were still following him. They were still a good way back, but it was definitely the same pack. Again, he put them out of his mind. He would worry about them when or if they got closer. Even in Maine, any homes or stores along Route 202, this section called the Carl Bragg Highway, were already stripped bare, but he managed to refill his water bottle from rainwater in an old trough. Towards dusk, he tried a few more houses for food, but was without luck. He picked one to spend the night in and didn't spot the dogs as he closed the door. But he wasn't so quick to assume he'd lost them as the day before. The next morning, a hungry Luke had only water for breakfast and set out again. Almost immediately, the dogs fell in behind him again, about a quarter-mile back. He was more fascinated than alarmed to realize they were stalking him. Unlike the packs he'd seen before, particularly the one that had attacked their group as they traveled to Drake Mountain, these ones didn't look crazed with hunger. They looked methodical and focused on their quarry, and he'd come to the unmistakable conclusion that he was their quarry. Feeling a little uneasy, but not frightened, he picked up his pace. An hour later, Luke came to an intersection. The left turn was a road that looked a lot more recently constructed than the 202, and the sign on the corner read, "Turn left for Willetton Greene subdivision. Lots available. Come join the happiest little community in Maine." The road sloped down the gently sloping hill into green fields and then wound its way through a copse of trees in the distance. Beyond that, he could see the late afternoon sun shining on the tiled roofs of a modern housing development. He turned and looked back the way he'd come. They slowed as soon as he turned, but the dogs were closer now, and he knew before long he would have to deal with them. He started down the hill and towards the happiest little community in Maine. The pack loped after him. 12. The young boy whistled sharply twice without taking the binoculars from his eyes as he watched the stranger turn towards Willetton Greene. He heard shouts behind him and knew the alarm was being passed along. Within a minute, a woman with dark hair pulled back in a ponytail climbed up into the lookout with him. "What have we got, Sam?" "Some big guy. He's got a pack of dogs following him. He should be coming out of the trees soon." "How many dogs?" 6. If they don't get him in the trees, we should be able to see them soon." 6? That's enough for the brothers and to keep 2 for ourselves if we get 'em all. Lord knows we need 'em. Is he armed?"
"He has an axe on his back."
"Guns?"
"Don't think so. But he has a hook hand."
"A what?"
"You know,"
he said, holding up his hand with his index finger curled.
"A hook, like the pirate in the picture book."
She wasn't interested. "Good boy. Give me the binocs and go get Tommy and Jacob. Tell them to bring the shotgun and their bows, and tell the other mothers there might be trouble coming, and to lock the doors until I give the all clear."
"Yes, Mama."
The woman watched her 7-year-old boy go, and then leaned her elbows on the top of the wall and raised the binoculars to her eyes. She focused them on the road where it emerged from the trees. The lookout they had built against their side of the wall was well hidden in the shadows under the leaves of the oak tree that grew on the other side. Ostensibly it was to give them early warning of the brothers coming to visit, but on occasions like this, it was a real handy early warning system for other visitors too, especially since the brothers wouldn't allow them to have a gate. The big guy emerged from the trees at a fair speed, and she took a good look at him. Tall and well-built, his face was handsome but dirty with travel grime. He looked like he'd been on the road a long time. Interestingly, he looked unconcerned by his pursuers. No doubt he knew they were there, but his long strides ate up the distance between the trees and Willetton Greene at a steady rather than panicked pace. "Must be slow in the head," she said, as she lowered the glasses. He was close enough to watch without assistance now. He was heading straight for the unprotected entrance of their village. Tommy, her 15-year-old brother, and his friend Jacob came running, and she turned on her perch and held out her hand. "Don't climb up. Pass me the shotgun and get to the gate, quick. Stay out of sight with your bows drawn. There's a stranger coming, and when he steps 1 foot through the entrance, I want you to turn him into a pincushion." Tommy passed up the weapon. "Once you shoot him, let him lie where he drops and restring your bows real quick. There's dogs chasing him, and with a bit of luck we'll bag a few. Go." "Yes, ma'am," said Jacob, and they turned to run. She had confidence the boys would do their job. The shotgun was just in case of an emergency. It was their only gun, the only one the brothers had let them keep. They didn't know about the bows, or they'd have been confiscated too. She turned back to watch the stranger coming, and saw the dogs come out of the trees behind him, close now. She leaned over the wall in anticipation. Then he stopped and looked up at the sign and scratched his chin with his hook as he looked through the opening to the town. "Come on," she urged in a whisper. He didn't. In fact, he turned around to look at the dogs. That's when he reached under his jacket at the back and pulled a pistol out of his belt. "Shit." She was about to turn and run to the boys when the stranger glanced back at the entrance. She held her breath. As if coming to a decision, he put the gun back in his belt and turned abruptly and began marching towards the dogs. Diana turned and threw the shotgun to the grass, jumping down from the platform and picking it up smoothly as she ran for the entrance. The boys looked around in surprise as she sped towards them. "Quick, he's going to take them on. He's got a gun in his belt. Get the dogs first and shoot him if he reaches for it." She flew through the gate as if the devil was on her heels, and they followed. The fight was already on as they ran through the gate. 2 dogs were bleeding and twitching on the ground, and as they ran up, the stranger was hit hard, crashing to the asphalt as they sped towards him. In a flash, the other 3 dogs were on him, and he disappeared beneath the quivering, heaving mass. "Shoot him while they're busy! Quick!" The 2 boys skidded to a halt and knocked their arrows again. "I'll take the big one," said Tommy as he closed one eye and pulled the string back. "You take any of the others." The leader of the pack looked up, his muzzle red with blood, a split second before Tommy's arrow took him in the side. He yelped, then he fell to the ground. The second shot was not as clean, hitting another dog in the haunches near its spine. Its yelp was more like a scream, and it tried to flee, its back legs dragging behind it. Another arrow hit it in the eye, putting it out of its misery. "Finished him for you," yelled Jacob. Tommy grunted. He had already knocked another arrow and loosed it before Jacob could beat him to the 3rd dog. This one was too intent on worrying at the leg of the big guy to notice the danger it was in. The arrow took him in the neck, and he collapsed, jaw locked on the leg of its erstwhile meal. The last dog seemed to sense danger and took off with its tail between its legs, only to fall a second later as Jacob's arrow took its left rear leg out from under it. Diana was on it in an instant, saving precious buckshot by clubbing the wounded dog hard over the head. She pulled a knife out of her jeans pocket and ended it. Tommy and Jacob high-fived each other. "2 each," said Jacob. "No, wait, dude. Di killed yours. I win 2-1. "No, I took it down." "Enough," yelled Diana, racking her shotgun and walking over to the unconscious man. She looked down and pointed the shotgun at his face. He was out cold, but apart from the bleeding lump on his head and a superficial wound on his neck, courtesy of the lead dog, his leather pants and jacket appeared to have protected him from the worst of the attack. Tommy walked over with the arrow he'd pulled from the lead dog. "We got all of them, sis. Well, with a little help from him," Tommy said, kicking the man in the hip. He knocked the gore-stained arrow and pointed it at the stranger's chest. "Want me to finish him?" Diana knew that would be easiest. It seemed lately there were no good men left in the world. Murderers and rapists, all of them. Best to end this one clean. Still, there was something about the way he carried himself, something about the way he showed no fear in going back to face the dogs without his gun. And had he sensed their trap? "No," she said, putting her hand on her brother's forearm and gently lowering his aim to the ground. "We'll take him back." "What? Why would we do that?" Tommy asked, his eyes wide. She didn't really have a good reason. "Just a feeling." She turned back towards the entrance. As she suspected, she had an audience. She put her hands to her mouth. "Bring the cart. We're having meat tonight." A cheer went up from the watchers. She turned and dropped to her knees, pulling the gun out of the stranger's belt. 13. Brooke was cooking at the stove when he walked into the farmhouse kitchen. Whatever it was, it smelled good. Real good. He told her as much. "What are we having, babe?" She didn't turn. She didn't answer. "Brooke?" She must be annoyed with me, he thought. He walked over to her. But something wasn't right. No matter how many steps he took, he couldn't seem to get any closer. It was like he was on a moving walkway going the wrong way. He tried to angle so he could see her face, but no matter how he strained, he could only see the back of her head. Maybe she couldn't hear him. It was no wonder the loud laughing and talking was damn annoying, and why was it so freaking hot? "Brooke!" Luke's own shout woke him up, and the loud laughter and conversation ceased abruptly. He looked around. It was dark. He was surrounded by a bunch of unfamiliar faces lit by the glow of a big fire a few feet from where he sat. He was in some sort of a chair. It was low to the ground like a deck chair or something similar. A boy of about 15 and a woman who looked a little older than Luke himself stood up and approached. The boy's lips glistened with the grease of a recently consumed meal. The woman was picking at her teeth. Feeling dazed from his second concussion in a week, he felt like he was still dreaming. He tried to sit up. He couldn't. He was restrained, and the side of his head pulsed angrily in time with the beating of his heart. "No use struggling, mister. You're tied up nice and tight," said the woman. She had straggly, dark hair pulled back off her face in a loose ponytail. Her face was pleasant without being beautiful. The set of her mouth was hard and determined. He eased his aching head back down, and his most recent memories came flooding back. The dogs. "You saved me?" he asked. But all that came out was an unintelligible croak. The boy laughed. "He's a retard, Di." She cuffed him over the ear. "Get the man some water, you idiot." The boy scowled, but did as he was told, disappearing behind Luke and returning a second later with a ladle of water. Luke gulped it down. "Thanks." "You hungry?" Diana asked. Luke looked past the woman and saw meat on a spit over the fire behind her. The aroma caressed his nose and his mouth filled with saliva. He nodded, not trusting himself to speak without dribbling. "Kathy, can you slice off some meat for our guest?" He saw a girl who looked to be a couple of years younger than Diana. She smiled shyly at him. "Sure can." While she worked at the spit, he took the opportunity to look around. The fire had been built in the middle of a suburban street. Neat homes, some with candlelight in the windows, lined both sides of the road. Apart from the unkempt lawns and the worn clothes the people around him wore, it could have been a 4th of July street party. The girl walked over holding a beaten-up aluminum plate stacked with steaming slices of meat. "Want me to feed it to him, Di?" "No, Kathy, hand it over. I'll take care of it." The girl looked disappointed, but smiled at him again. "Don't bite my fucking fingers," warned Diana, as she picked up a slice and held it over his mouth. Luke was hungry enough to swallow it whole, but took it between his teeth and forced himself to chew it thoroughly so he could savor the hot, salty morsel. While she hand-fed him, Luke regarded the group of people around him. Most had gone back to their own eating, although he was still getting a lot of attention. One thing stood out. There were no full-grown men, even though he saw at least 4 women in their 20s. The boy who had called him a retard seemed to be about the oldest of the males. His belly was satisfyingly full by the time she finished. Somehow even his aching head felt better. More? He shook his head. He could have easily eaten more, but knew he would probably only sick it up later if he overate after close to 3 days of near fasting. Just some more water, if you have enough. The boy brought him another ladle of water and then went back to the fire. "I'm Diana," the woman said, after taking the empty plate back to the fire. "I'm Luke," he said. "Thanks for the meat." "You're welcome," she said, with a brief smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. "Thanks for bringing it our way." Luke suddenly realized what he had just eaten. Diana laughed at the look on his face. "They had a good chew on you before we killed them," she said, looking down at his lower legs. He followed her gaze. His leathers were torn up pretty good, and there was a clean bandage around his lower left leg. He hadn't felt it till she pointed it out, but now that he was aware of it, his leg started stinging. Funny how the body worked. "Guess I have to thank you on 2 counts. "It's fine. We cleaned and disinfected the bites, but if they had rabies, that probably won't help. We'll have to shoot you." Luke laughed. She didn't, because she wasn't joking. "Where are you from?" she asked. "Rhode Island originally." Luke then gave her an abbreviated version of his story and told her where he was heading. "Portland?" she asked, her eyes narrowing. The talk around the fire hushed, and all eyes were on them again. "Yeah, why?" "Exactly, why? Why Portland?" Luke suddenly felt he was on dangerous ground, but had no idea why. He shrugged. In this case, he decided honesty was the best policy. "I went there as a kid. It was the best holiday I ever had. I guess I just wanted to see the ocean again." She seemed to relax. "I see." "Is there a problem with Portland?" "Don't know," she said, and her face told him the subject was closed. He didn't push it. "So I couldn't help but notice there are no men." "Nope." "Why?" "All dead." "I'm sorry. What happened?" "You ask an awful lot of questions, mister." "Sorry, I'm just curious. Tell me to shut up if I bug you too much." She regarded him a moment, as if trying to read his thoughts. "So you don't know what's in Portland?" He looked at her blankly. "Old shops, the seaside." "Not what. I mean, like, who?" He shook his head. Diana bit her lip as if weighing up something. She looked at the one called Kathy, who gave a quick nod. "Have you heard of the Brotherhood?" "No, should I have?" "Not sure, but you sure as hell wouldn't be thinking of going to Portland if you had." "Who are they?" She spat on the ground. "They're the reason there are no men older than 15 here. When the boys turn 16, they come and take them to God." "What?" "They take them to God. It's a fancy way of saying they draft them into their army." Luke thought about this. "I take it you don't get a choice?" "Nope. There's a graveyard right behind that house over there marked with the crosses of those who said no." "You fought them?" She nodded. "When?" "The first time?" She looked at him fiercely. 2 years ago. Looked all friendly and God-fearing, wearing their crosses and carrying staffs like fucking monks." "What happened?" he asked, noting that everyone had started listening, some moving closer to hear better. "We let 'em in. We had gates then. They didn't look no trouble and we had lots of guns. We were being neighborly. Stephen always said—" Her voice hitched.
We can't lose our humanity. And now, well, he was the first one they killed.
Kathy went to her and put her hand on Diana's shoulder.
They came in and ate with us, Kathy said. Then Brother Mike, the leader, told us that he wanted the men to come and serve God. Stephen said, "Thanks for the offer, but we serve God in our own way." And we did, still do. The community center is our church.
Luke felt like he had some unfinished business with the man upstairs. "That's great. I'd like to pray there sometime if you'll let me." He wasn't lying. Diana's raw emotion had triggered his own thoughts about Brooke. Praying was the one thing he hadn't done since losing her. It felt about time.
"Anyway," Kathy continued, "Brother Mike said it's not an offer. And that's when things went south, real fast."
Diana took over again, her eyes far away.
"Long story short, things got a little heated and we kicked them out. I remember Brother Mike saying, 'You don't want to do this, my son,' and Stephen spitting on the ground at his feet as we shut the gate on them. Stephen said, 'I'm not your son. Stay away.' They came back the next day, drove their stupid truck with its golden crosses all over it straight through the gate. They poured out of that truck, at least 20 of them, and some had guns. We managed to kill a few, but they had too many men."
Kathy took up the story again.
"They shot all the men and 2 of the women before the rest of us surrendered. We had to, or they would have killed us all."
"Of course, you did what you had to." Kathy looked down at Diana, who was quietly weeping again. Diana nodded.
"One by one, they executed our people who had been injured but not killed. And then Brother Mike dragged Stephen out into the middle of the main street so everyone could see. 'Let this be a lesson to you,' he said. 'God punishes those who shirk their responsibilities, and we are the hand of God in this world.' They shot him in the head."
Silence fell over the group, the horror of what had happened 2 years before still fresh on their faces. "So they haven't been back?"
"Of course they've been back,"
spat Diana.
"They're like a cancer. You can't get rid of them. They come back every full moon, and we give them a contribution."
"A contribution?"
"It's what they call it. Food and stuff we've grown or stuff we've scavenged that we think they might want."
"What happens if you don't?" She looked at him like he had turned idiot.
"What do you think happens? We haven't let ourselves find out. This time they'll be taking Tommy and Jacob with them. They're of age."
She nodded in the direction of a teenage girl with sad eyes.
"And probably Sarah, too."
Diana's eyes told him all he needed to know about why they'd be taking the girl. He looked up at the perfect half moon. That meant they had roughly a week before the brothers were due. "You could fight them, you know. I could help them."
"No. We fight, we die." "We could fight, die," said Tommy, coming forward. His friend Jacob backed him up with a solid, "Yeah." "Don't be fools," she snapped, then put her hand on Tommy's shoulder. "You'll be the first ones they kill, Tommy. I can't lose you, too. At least this way you'll be alive, and you and Jacob can look after each other and look out for Sarah." Tommy let it go. "It's time to bed down," said Diana. "Stoke the fire for our guest."
"You're going to leave me here?" Luke asked.
"Yep," she said, smiling but not unkindly, as she draped a threadbare blanket over him. "I was actually going to slash your throat if you caused a ruckus, but I think you're all right. If you behave tonight, we'll talk more in the morning. I might even untie you."
"Gee, thanks," he said.
"You're welcome," she said. He couldn't tell if she was ignoring his sarcasm or didn't notice it. Jacob and Tommy put some more wood on the fire as everyone started to head into the houses.
When they had it roaring nicely, Tommy came across and stood over him.
"No funny business, mister, or a throat slashing is the least you'll have to worry about."
Luke looked up at him, suppressing a smile. The kid was a bear cub trying to protect his family. "Sure thing, Tommy. I'm not here to cause any trouble." Satisfied, the boy nodded and turned and headed back across the road to the house Diana had gone into. His friends followed him. Luke tested his restraints. There was no give. Nothing for it but to try and sleep. He was warm and comfortable, but his head ached. His leg was throbbing a little now, too. He began to think about his next move. He suspected he was going to be able to leave Willetton Greene with no problem. Diana and her group seemed decent enough, and he didn't intend on giving them any trouble. Problem was, if they were right about Portland, he would have to change his plans. No sense walking out of the frying pan into the fire. That wasn't the worst of it, though. Luke had always hated bullies, and this brotherhood sounded like the worst type. The type who killed in the name of God. He was surprised that this was the first time he'd heard of such a group since the flu had wiped out the country. In nearly every movie or book he'd consumed about the end of the world as a teenager, religious fanatics made at least one appearance. It wasn't a stretch to believe that the post-apocalyptic world would be fertile ground for people looking to find meaning in what had happened, and in their new lives by turning to religion. There was nothing wrong with that. In fact, it was human nature. But there were always those who could twist it to their own wicked interpretation. One needed to look no further than Islamic jihadists. Luke fell asleep about an hour after his hosts had retired for the evening. 14. Luke woke up to find a young boy of about 8 looking down and examining him curiously. The throbbing in his leg was worse than it had been the night before. On a positive note, though, his head seemed better.
"Samuel, leave the man alone or you'll freak him out."
Diana was at the fire, stirring a large pot hanging over it on a rudely made timber frame. The kid retreated. The resemblance to Diana was obvious. They both had the same dark eyes and olive skin. "Your son?" Luke asked, brushing the hair from his brow, only then realizing he was untied. She nodded. "He looks like you." Carefully, he swung his legs over and sat up on the deck chair. It creaked under his weight. No one else had yet emerged from the other houses. "Thanks for letting me loose."
"You're welcome. Want some oatmeal?"
"Oatmeal? Where the hell did you get oatmeal?"
"We grow the oats, of course."
"Seriously?"
"Sure. Want to see?"
"Yes, I do." Luke stood up and gingerly put weight on his bandaged leg. It was painful, but in a stinging kind of way rather than achy.
"You all right?"
Diana asked, walking over to him. "Yes, just sore."
"What about your head?"
He rapped himself on the skull. "Hard as ever." "Which way?"
"Samuel,"
she said to her son.
"Stay here and stir the oats. We'll be back soon. Just going to show the man the farm."
"It's Luke." She smiled.
"I'm just going to show Luke the farm."
The farm was actually a repurposed park in the center of the subdivision. Despite this, Luke couldn't help but be impressed. It was barely half an acre, but had been sectioned into 4 segments, and to his untrained eye, was flourishing.
"That's the oats crop,"
Diana said, pointing to the largest of the section. It just looked like tall, dry weeds to Luke, and he said as much.
"I guess it does."
She laughed. As they walked closer, Diana explained that Stephen had grown up on his father's farm. One of the first things he'd insisted on was growing crops. After the Chinese had retreated, he had spent at least a month on a trip to Montville, the town where he grew up, scavenging as many seeds and grain and tools as he could. His efforts had borne fruit, and vegetable, and grains. They grew potatoes, pumpkins, and carrots, and had a decent plot of corn as well as the oat crop. Luke ran his hand over the feathery tops of the oat grass. So how do you harvest it? Must be hard work.
Oh, no, the harvesting is the easy bit, she said. Separating the chaff from the grain is the worst bit.
Luke looked at her blankly. Sorry, I'm a city boy through and through.
Here, she said, pulling a long stem towards her. She pointed to the seed heads lining the long stems. See these pointy bits? They're the husks, and inside them are the actual oat grains. We got to separate them from the grains by hand before we can mill them. We're due to harvest this crop in a couple of days, actually.
Luke looked over the field. Holy cow. Even in this little patch, you must have millions of them.
Yep. So when you're eating your oatmeal in a minute, just remember how much blood, sweat, and tears went into it.
Yum. Sounds appetizing.
She laughed, deciding right then she liked him. Come on. Enough of the tour. Now you get to sample the goods.
So what do you do for meat? He asked her on the way back. You know, when strangers aren't leading dogs to you.
Apart from the chickens and the occasional rabbit, she said, her cheeks reddening, we've just gone without. We have 2 goats. We'd never eat those. The kids raised them from babies, so they're just for milk. He was glad to see he wasn't the only one who felt a bit funny about eating dog. Perhaps it was a necessity, but it didn't mean they had to like it.
Where are the rest of the dogs we killed?
Butchered and salted. We have a house set aside for that. We'll give the brothers 4 and keep the last one. They headed back to the fire, and she served him a steaming plate of oatmeal.
So how much of your crops do you have to give them?
Half.
And how many people do you have altogether?
35.
Luke did some figuring in his head. That doesn't leave you with much. No wonder they were so happy about the dogs.
We get by, she said, and shrugged. Later that day, Luke sat on a bench by the fire as she unwrapped the bandaging on his leg. The bite marks were starting to scab over, and thankfully there was none of the redness or swelling that might indicate infection.
So, he said as she was rebandaging, my plan of visiting Portland is dead in the water. Do you mind if I stick around for a while?
She pondered this for a moment, several emotions at war on her face, and when she opened her mouth to answer, he knew the answer would be no.
I can help around the place, he said, preempting her, hunting and such. I'm not even above dehusking the oats if you want. I promise I'll bring more food in than I eat.
I really like you, Luke, but I can't say yes. I would have to call a meeting so everyone could vote. Even if they said yes, though, it would be pointless. If you're here when the Brotherhood come in a week or so, they'll take you, or kill you if you resist.
You're really going to let them take the kids?
Luke immediately regretted the question. Diana paused, replacing the bandage, and her eyes filled with tears. You think I want to? She asked through gritted teeth. He's my kid brother. But if you're asking if I'd prefer to see him go with them than dead on the ground, the answer is yes.
Sorry, said Luke,
feeling like a heel. He decided to persevere, though.
Listen, I can hide out when they come. Besides, when they take the 3, you'll be down numbers and I can help bear some of the load.
She bit her lip and concentrated on finishing her job before looking up at him. I'll put it to a vote, she said, and stood up, wiping her hands on her jeans. But the answer will be final.
Okay, he agreed. So where is this little church?
15. Diana left him alone in the hall of the small community center. Their place of worship was, as he expected, quite Spartan. An optimistic number of chairs were set in rows facing the front, where a roughly hewn but impressive cross made of 2 weathered railway sleepers
hung on the wall above a low dais and lectern. As he walked to the front, he looked at the faded posters that lined the wall. They advertised book drives and child-minding and the like. A monument to the original purpose of the building. It was comforting but sad at the same time. He sat on a chair and closed his eyes. "God," he began, "I want to believe you're there. I need to. So here goes. Please look after my beautiful Brooke and our baby." His voice cracked, and he took a deep breath before continuing. "They were taken from me, but I want to believe you had a reason for allowing that to happen. It doesn't make me feel any better about it, but I guess I just need to get this out. I fucking hate you for taking them from me. I mean, what were you thinking, dude? The only thing that keeps me going is that I can still see good in this messed up world. Sorry for swearing, but man." He took another deep breath and wiped away his tears with the back of his hand. "Anyway, I want you to tell Brooke I love her and our baby with all my heart. Tell her I'm sorry I couldn't save her, but I promise I'll try and make up for it. That's it, I guess. Except I'll see her before long." He stood up. "Thanks. And amen." Diana stood up after the evening meal. "We're taking a vote. Luke wants to stay on for a time." There were a few claps and a whistle. "I'm voting no. The Brotherhood are due soon, and if he's found here, he'll be taken or killed, and they'll probably kill a few more of us for good measure. If he manages to stay undiscovered when they come, it will be another mouth for us to feed, and no offense, Luke," she said, looking up at him, "a pretty big one at that." This drew some laughter. "Do you want to say anything before the vote, Luke?" "Sure. Well, I just want to say thanks for taking me in, and I'll accept whatever you decide. If you let me stay, I promise I'll work hard and do my best to produce more than I use, or eat," he said, putting a hand on his belly and looking sidelong at Diana. The result was 23-9 in favor of no. "Sorry," said Diana, coming across to him afterwards. "It's okay. I understand it's a pretty big deal to take a perfect stranger in." "You're welcome to stay for 2 more nights. That'll give you plenty of time to get your strength back, and your legs should be as right as rain by then." "Thanks." Luke made an effort to socialize with the rest of the group afterwards. He had no hard feelings towards them. He may have even voted the same way himself if he'd been in their position. He liked that every night through the spring and summer they had a communal fire, and all ate together. They were a small enough group to do that, and it really added to a sense of community. What a shame they'd been interfered with by this brotherhood. He graduated to an old sleeping bag in front of the fire that night. He half expected a visit in the night from Diana's friend, Kathy. She had spent a good part of the night flirting with him, but he hoped his gentle rebuffs had gotten the message through. An awkward scene was the last thing he wanted. 16. The next day they began scything and harvesting the oats. Luke was happy to help. He noticed an unspoken ramping up in the speed of their work and knew it had to do with the impending visit of the brothers in 5 days. "Thanks so much," Diana said that night as they sat around the fire, nursing blisters and sore muscles. "It normally takes a day and a half to scythe the whole field, but we did it in 1. "Not a problem. It took me a while to work out how to hold the damn thing with this," he said, holding up his hook. "But once I did, it was a breeze." "No, it wasn't," she laughed. "No, you're right," he grinned, and rubbed the shoulder where he had wedged the handle while he'd swung the bladed tool with his good hand. "My armpit hurts like a bitch, not to mention my back." "You're sure that's not from the pitching?" During their break for lunch, he'd spotted Tommy and Jacob playing with a beaten-up old Louisville slugger, and an even more beaten, out-of-shape ball. He asked if he could join in. They'd let him, grudgingly, and he took turns pitching to them. While they'd been cagey at first, still not trusting him entirely, before long they were happily taking turns, listening to his random stories about the history of the game. "Positive, that part was fun," he said, holding up his hook, "even if I didn't get a turn at bat because of this." The next day they began de-husking and separating the grains from the chaff. Diana was right. Harvesting had been the easy part, and in a way, Luke was glad he didn't have two hands. He made up for it by helping with the heavy lifting, stacking, and anything else that needed doing, so that the nimble hands of the rest could concentrate on the task at hand. They would be at it for days, but still, it was honest work, and the sense of community still shone through, no matter how tedious the work was. By the end of that day they had 2 sacks full and still had 3/4 of the bushels they had cut down to go. As they ate stew around the fire that night, Luke offered to stay one more day. "I know I was supposed to go tomorrow morning, but if I stick around tomorrow and go the next day, you'll be past the worst of it. And you'll have 2 more sacks. 4 is all you need for them, right? Then you can start on the vegetables."
"Maybe we should have a revote, Di?" asked Tommy.
"Yeah," said Jacob, along with a few others. Tommy had been the most enthusiastic of the no voters, perhaps seeing Luke as a threat to his own position. The 2 oldest boys in the group were clearly more enamored of him now than they had been before they'd gotten to know him. Diana ignored her brother. "Okay, 1 more day, but then you definitely have to scoot the morning after tomorrow." "Okay, deal." They filled 3 more sacks the next day, and Luke got a start on digging up potatoes, managing to fill a barrel by the time they finished for the day. "Why don't you hide how much you have?" Luke asked on his final night. "Maybe put 4 sacks on display so they only take 2?
"We've tried that. They found us out and ended up taking our whole harvest of oats. That was bad. Real bad. We lost 2 kids that winter."
Luke was silent, his distaste for the Brotherhood growing incrementally with every example of their cruelty. He didn't talk about fighting them again. Diana had clearly decided through experience that resistance was not worth it. He might not agree, but it was their community, not his. Diana came over to him as the last of her people retired for the evening.
"I want to thank you for your help. We would have done it without you, but it would have taken a lot longer."
"No problemo. Thank you for rescuing me and letting me stay here for a while." The normally non-demonstrative Diana then reached up and pulled him into a bear hug. The show of affection took him by surprise. While totally platonic, her show of affection was out of character.
"It's a bit cooler tonight. Why don't you sleep on the couch in our living room?"
"Sure, that would be great. Thanks." As it was, they stayed up later than the others, sitting by the fire and talking about their lives before the attack. Diana had lived in Augusta with her parents, an only child. They'd succumbed to the flu quickly, just like his parents, and she'd basically curled into a ball on her bed and not moved for 2 days. As far as she knew, it was the end of the world, and that's where she'd die. That was when 3 of her friends had turned up and persuaded her to go with them. They spent a month on the run, hiding out from the Chinese as they made their way southwest, until almost starving and in a bad way physically, they met Stephen and his group. He'd been out hunting and offered to take them to his camp for a hot meal.
"That's how I ended up in Willetton, Greene."
"What about your friends?"
"Well, I guess we weren't that close. Stephen told us we could stay. They didn't want to. I did. They left."
There was obviously some pain related to that parting. Luke didn't press any further, and Diana stood.
"I'm beyond tired. I'll see you in the morning," she said, and rose wearily to her feet. "Good night, Luke."
"Night, Diana." The next morning, Diana cooked another batch of oatmeal. Luke had 2 full bowls and went back to the fire for another.
"See, I told you we couldn't afford to keep you around. You'd eat us out of house and home."
Well, if you didn't make it so delicious, I wouldn't need a third helping, Luke laughed. After he finished, Luke stood, his belly over full. Well, I better make tracks. Diana stood. Tommy, Jacob, go get Luke's gear. They came back with his axe and a small satchel. Luke slung his axe over his shoulder and then pointed to the satchel. What's that? Just some food and water. Enough for a day or two if you stretch it out, said Diana. Thanks, he said. I won't say no. He pulled her into a hug and then hugged the others who came up to say goodbye. Tommy and Jacob will see you to the gate. Okay. Thanks again for having me, he said, and gave her a salute. Luke fell in behind the two teenagers. Oh, wait, I almost forgot. He turned back. Diana reached behind and under the light jacket she was wearing and produced his Glock. She held it out by the barrel as she fished the spare clips from her jeans pocket. Luke held up his hand and hook. No, you keep the gun. A gift for saving my life. No, really. You should take it. It's dangerous out there. Doesn't matter. It's dangerous here, too. Think of it as an extra layer of protection, especially if you're losing the boys. She looked like she was going to argue further, but in the end nodded and smiled before tucking the gun away again. Thanks. A few minutes later, Luke was walking back through the entrance to Willetton Greene and headed up the hill where he had nearly lost his life to the pack of dogs. He turned back once before entering the trees and saw Tommy and Jacob still watching. He gave them one last wave before disappearing. 17. He paused when he got back to the junction of the 202. Well, where to now, Lukey boy? He asked himself. You know what? I still want to see the ocean. Screw the Brotherhood. He pulled the creased map from the pocket of his leather jacket and unfolded it on the road top. One day's walk along the 202 would see him arrive in a town called Alfred, where he could stop for the night. From there, he could join the 101. That would take him the rest of the way to the coast. A name on the map jumped out at him. Old Orchard Beach. He remembered his family had done a day trip from Portland to Old Orchard Beach. It had been about a 25-minute drive south, but was directly east from his current location. That would do nicely, and hopefully the change of destination would help him avoid the Brotherhood altogether. He set off with a bit more energy in his steps. He would get to see the ocean and relive some fond memories after all. He remembered spending a good hour playing pinball in the arcade on the old wooden pier. He wondered if it was still standing. Luke stopped for the night in Alfred. The town was abandoned, and a cursory observation told him it had been pretty much looted bare. Despite that and the late afternoon sunshine, it looked inviting. It was leafy and looked like it had been a quiet little town where he imagined everyone had known everyone. He didn't waste time looking for food. He'd only eaten one sandwich and a carrot for lunch, so still had enough for 2 days. He topped up the water bottle Diana had packed for him with rainwater from a puddle and picked a house a few streets off the main road to sleep in. There was no need to break down the door. It was already off its hinges, as were the doors of every house he saw. He headed up the stairs and found an unoccupied bedroom with a dusty bed and pillow upon which to rest his head. The door had a lock, so he made use of it, but was not really concerned about uninvited visitors through the night. Before closing his eyes, he rolled over and pulled out the bedside drawer and reached in. You never know what you might find. He scrabbled around in the dark, and his fingers found a book, a set of keys, and some loose coins. He pocketed the coins, not really thinking about why, and was about to pull his hand out when his fingers brushed against a soft, papery box tucked right up the back. Cigarettes. Excitedly, he felt around, hoping to find a lighter. He didn't. But what he did find was a half-used book of matches. Not as good as a lighter, but it would do. He pocketed them, too, and closed his eyes. Dawn was just touching the eastern horizon when he set out the next morning. Barring unforeseen circumstances, he estimated he should arrive in Old Orchard Beach late that afternoon. The trip was uneventful until around midday, when he came across the strangest sight he'd seen since setting out with Isaac all those years ago. He had just passed through a small town and was traveling down an open length of road with forest on either side when he saw rustling in the bushes about 30 yards ahead. From the amount of noise and movement, he could tell it was something big, something bear big. He had only just paused and put his bag down in case he needed to quickly unloose his axe, when an African lion sauntered onto the road carrying a fresh kill, a fox, dangling from its jaws. Luke froze, his mouth hanging open. A lion on a road in Maine. Robert Frost would be rolling over in his grave. With his heart pounding in his chest, he watched it. It looked as though it was going to cross the road without looking his way, but then, almost as if sensing he had company, the lion stopped and swung its big, maned head his way. Golden eyes as big as baseballs met his. Luke held the big animal's gaze and stood as still as he could. It was only a few seconds, but to Luke it felt like 10 minutes before the king of the forest dismissed him and disappeared into the brush on the other side of the road. "Well, now I've seen it all," he said. He stayed put to make sure the big fellow wasn't coming back. After a few minutes, his heart rate returned to normal, and he set off again, glancing over his shoulder several times to make sure he wasn't being stalked by a big-ass kitty. It was mid-afternoon as he entered Biddeford. It was big, but a ghost town. He didn't plan to find out if there were any inhabitants after his troubles back in Bow Lake Village, and stuck to the road all the way to an intersection called the Five Ways. He turned onto the one here, also known as Elm Street, and briefly thought of the horror movie A Nightmare on Elm Street. That movie had given him nightmares as a kid. His older cousin Tony had insisted they watch it at a sleepover. It just seemed childish and silly now, given what they had all lived through since. Crossing over the Saco River, he spotted the first people he had seen since Willetton Greene. In the distance and heading his way were a man and a woman leading a horse and cart. The clip-clop of the horses' hooves echoed off the buildings around them. Luke maintained a steady pace. They looked harmless enough. As they drew closer, he saw they were around his age, the man tall and thin with a scraggly beard, the woman much shorter. They wore what looked to be homespun clothes, set off incongruously by matching bright red baseball caps. The couple eyed him suspiciously, and he realized he must look a little sinister with his leathers and axe handle showing over his shoulder. Luke raised his hand and smiled. "Hey," he called, only then realizing the woman had a shawl-wrapped baby held against her chest. He felt tears sting his eyes as a brief wave of emotion rolled over him. "Hi," said the man, maintaining his pace. Luke slowed a little but didn't move towards them. He noted the cart was empty. "Are you coming from Old Orchard Beach?" "Yes, sir. We sold a batch of pumpkins and bought some supplies." This earned the man an elbow in the ribs from his companion. "It's all right, Nat. We can't be scared of everyone." "No, ma'am, no danger here. I'm just passing through," Luke said, holding up his hands. Well, one hand and one hook. The woman's eyes widened, and he put them down sheepishly. "So, there are people in the town, then?" The other guy slowed his horse and cart to a stop. His partner glared up at him, but didn't protest. "Oh, for sure. Lots." "Awesome," said Luke, thinking the opposite. "You can get yourself a meal and an ale. You look like you could use one." Luke laughed. "Yep, I reckon I could. So there is a market or something?" "Yeah, a big one. You have anything to sell?" "No. Who runs it all?" The couple looked at each other, and then the young woman nodded. "The town kind of runs itself, but they answer to the Brotherhood." "I see." "You know them?" "I've heard tell of them," said Luke, totally unaware he was speaking like a character from a bad Western movie. The man let out the rope he was leading the horse with and came closer. "Just watch yourself with them.
They're okay if you don't stir the pot, but they patrol the town, kind of like cops. They're pretty tough on troublemakers."
"Thanks for the heads up," said Luke. "Let me guess. They don't provide policing for free?"
"No, sir. There's a cost, but the people in town are happy to pay."
"They pay for protection and nothing bad happens?"
"That's about the sum of it."
"A good old-fashioned protection racket. How many people are in town?"
Don't know for sure, but I'd guess a couple of thousand."
"And they don't take the boys when they turn 16?
"No, sir, not from Old Orchard anyway. Just those that want to volunteer."
It figured, thought Luke. A few thousand people were likely to cause a whole lot more of a ruckus if someone took their sons than a smaller settlement. The baby began to bawl. "I better let you go then. Do you have far to travel?"
"No, sir,"
said the other man, tugging on the rope and taking his wife's hand.
"Just a few miles. Take care."
"You too," said Luke, walking on. He stopped after a few paces and turned, watching the small family go on their way. His face was devoid of emotion as he turned back east. His eyes, another story altogether. He stopped to refill his bottle from a bucket of almost fresh water sitting under the downpipe of a gas station before continuing on his way. When he came across a sign to the Wild Acres RV Resort about a mile out from Old Orchard Beach proper, he turned right and headed towards it. The conversation with the couple about the Brotherhood patrolling the town and the fact that he was dog-tired helped him decide to stay the night in the RV park. Better to be fresh and well-rested in case of trouble. Luke found an empty trailer, ate his last half sandwich, and crashed for the night. He was still hungry, but at least he would deal with whatever he found in Old Orchard Beach after a good night's sleep.